Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. The Appalachian Mountains hold secrets that have never been told, stories that books have chosen not to tell. Please tell us where you're watching from now, because you're about to meet Joseph and Clara Green. These are two names that should be on record but have simply vanished from official stories. This video is made up, and its only purpose is to entertain. There is no connection between this and real people, living or dead. In 1908, deep in the West Virginia mountains, fog creeps between the pine trees like ghostly fingers. The Appalachian region has always been a place where people could live away from the law and other people. The roads were made of dirt, and it took weeks for news to get from one valley to another. It was a different world with its own set of unspoken rules. Joseph Green was 23 when he met Clara at a fair in Pocahontas County in the fall. She was also 23, with black hair and eyes that seemed to know things that had happened a long time ago. The two people knew each other right away, as if an unseen force drew them together. There was no clear answer as to where Clara came from. Some people said she came from Kentucky, while others swore they had seen her come down from the highest mountains, where even hunters were afraid to go. Their love was quick and strong. Joseph quit his job in the coal mines, and Clara left everything behind that she had before. They built a cabin on the side of Mount Shavers, away from other people. People in the area quickly started to talk about how strange that couple was, and how something didn't seem right. They only came to town when they needed supplies, and they always looked far away and said very little. Months went by, and rumors started to spread. People who traveled through that part of the mountain said they saw strange lights near the green cabin at night. Some people said they heard voices singing in languages they didn't know, but no one wanted to look into it. People in the Appalachian Mountains learn early on that it's not polite to get involved in other people's business. Silence was the key to staying alive. It was in March 1909, on a Saturday afternoon, that everything started to go wrong. Howard Bentley, a fabric merchant, was on his way back from making a delivery when he saw something strange on the path to the Green property. Deep, dragging marks in the ground, as if something heavy had been pulled down the hill. Howard followed the marks out of curiosity and found pieces of ripped clothing stuck in the bushes. He knew the fabric. It was the same one he had sold to a woman who had been in the area 2 weeks earlier. Howard ran to town and told the county sheriff, Ernest Caldwell, what he had seen. People knew that the sheriff didn't like going up into the mountains. He knew that a lot of bad things happened up there that were best left alone. But community pressure forced him to act. He gathered 4 volunteers and set off toward the Greens' cabin the following morning. When they arrived, they found the property strangely silent. The cabin door was ajar, swaying in the wind. Inside, everything seemed too tidy, almost as if someone had cleaned in a hurry. There was no sign of Joseph or Clara. The beds were made, the dishes washed, but there was a smell in the air that no one could identify. Something sweet and heavy that clung to the throat. The sheriff and his deputies searched the surrounding area. That's when one of the volunteers, an experienced hunter named Samuel Pruitt, found something behind the cabin, an area of recently disturbed earth, as if someone had dug it up and filled it back in. Samuel began to dig with his hands, and soon his fingers touched something soft and cold. He recoiled immediately, his face pale. Sheriff Caldwell ordered them to stop right there. He knew that if they continued, they would find something that would change everything. But Joseph and Clara Green were already gone. No one saw them leaving the mountain. It was as if they had dissolved into the mist that covered the Appalachians every morning. The official records from that time are unclear and seem to be missing on purpose. The Pocahontas Times, the town's newspaper, only published a short note about the event that didn't include any names or details. It seemed like everyone had agreed to forget that Joseph and Clara were real people. In the following months, more reports surfaced. People from nearby villages started to remember other people who had gone missing in that mountain area. A traveling salesman who never came back from a trip, and a woman who went out to gather herbs for medicine and was never seen again. There was an invisible thread that connected each story to the Greens' cabin, but no one wanted to pull it all the way to the end. The mist on the mountain hides things that time doesn't want to show. Sheriff Caldwell was trying to put the little information he had into some kind of order when something strange happened. The county files started to go missing. The courthouse's dusty shelves held papers about land purchases, birth records, and even the Greens' tax books, but they all disappeared. Martha Weaver, the archivist for Pocahontas County, said she had seen those papers the week before. She was a very careful person who was known for being very organized. When she saw the gaps in the records in 1909, she tried to bring them to the attention of local officials. Nobody wanted to hear it. People told her to let it go and not ask any more questions. Martha did what she was told, but she kept a diary where she wrote down her suspicions. Joseph and Clara had been in the area for about 2 years before the event, but it was still unclear where they came from. Joseph said he had worked in the mines, but none of the foremen could remember him. Clara said she was from a family in Kentucky, but when someone tried to check, they couldn't find anything. It was like the mountain made both of them, and they came out of the shadows with no past or history. What interested the people living there was how the couple changed. For the first few months, they were sometimes seen in town buying flour, salt, and kerosene. Joseph didn't say much, but he was polite. Clara smiled, but her eyes never looked like they were smiling. Over time, they stopped coming as often. When they did show up, they brought with them an uneasy feeling that made people look away. People said that the Greens didn't live in the cabin by themselves. Some witnesses said they had seen other figures on the property, like shadows moving through the trees at dusk. Thomas Mackenzie, a lumberjack, walked by the cabin one day and heard more than 2 people talking in low tones. When he got closer to offer help, he thought maybe there were lost travelers. But then everything went quiet. There was only Joseph on the porch, and he was staring at him hard. Thomas never went back to that path. Months later, he told the story in a tavern, but everyone laughed and said he had drunk too much or thought the echo of the mountains was real conversations. But Thomas wasn't a man who lived in dreams. He knew what he had heard, and he also knew that he wasn't welcome in that part of the woods. 2 weeks after the sheriff found the disturbed area of land in May 1909, a researcher from Charleston came to the area. Richard Portman was his name, and people said he was good at solving cases that other people had missed. Richard was not the kind of person who could be easily scared. He had worked on tough cases in the eastern part of the state and thought that the truth always left signs, no matter how hard someone tried to hide them. Richard started by talking to people who lived nearby. Most of them didn't want to talk. People who agreed to talk did so in whispers and looked over their shoulders as if they were afraid of being heard. One of the few people who talked a little was an old woman named Edith Branson. She said she had seen Clara Green in town a few weeks before she went missing. Clara was buying rope and heavy fabric, which is strange for someone who lived alone. Edith said something else that made Richard squint. Clara had asked about the old cattle trails that cut through the mountains. These were paths that no one had used since the railroad came to the area. They were old paths that led to deep valleys and caves where the first settlers used to hide. Why would anyone want to learn about these empty places? Richard chose to look into the green cabin on his own. The sheriff tried to talk him out of it by saying there was nothing there but an empty lot, but Richard wouldn't listen. One June morning, when the fog still covered the pine trees like a thick blanket, he climbed the mountain by himself. As soon as he got to the cabin, he knew something was wrong. The building looked older than it was because the wood was worn in a way that didn't match a building built just 2 years ago. Richard walked in through the door, which was still loose on its hinges. There was a thin layer of dust on everything inside. He started looking for things that could tell a story. He found a small leather-bound notebook under a board that wasn't very tight on the floor. The pages were dirty and hard to read, but there were notes written by hand. They weren't regular diaries, they were lists with names, dates, and short descriptions. Richard knew some of the names. They were people who had gone missing in the area in the last few years. There was a note next to each entry with coded words that he couldn't fully understand, but there were patterns. All of the names had one thing in common. They were travelers, people who were passing through and didn't have close family who could look for them. Richard put the notebook away and kept looking. He found a door at the back of the cabin that led to a small basement. The stairs were steep and not well built. He carefully went down and lit an oil lamp. The air down there was thick and wet. There were only empty shelves on the walls and metal hooks hanging from the ceiling. But the dirt on the floor had old, dark stains. Richard Portman came out of that basement with more questions than answers. He went back to the city to find out where Joseph and Clara had gone. But all he found were closed doors and people who wouldn't look him in the eye. People in the Appalachian Mountains had an unspoken rule. What happens in the mountains stays in the mountains. Even if it meant hiding uncomfortable truths, it was a rule that kept the peace. The researchers spent weeks looking for the couple. He looked at train stations in 3 different counties, talked to merchants on back roads, and even went to churches that were far away where people sometimes sought shelter. Nothing. It was as if the ground they walked on had swallowed up Joseph and Clara. Richard wrote an unfinished report in July 1909 and went back to Charleston, feeling frustrated and restless. But the Green family's story didn't end when the investigation was called off. It really just changed shape. People who lived nearby started to see strange things in the woods around the old property. Animals stayed away from the area, making a silent circle around it. Experienced hunters would not set traps in that area of the mountain. They said that something had happened there that changed the land and that it had been marked. A theory started to spread quietly among the older people. They remembered stories from the first settlers who came to the Appalachian Mountains. These stories were about couples who made deals with the beings that lived in the deep caves, where sunlight never reached. Of course, they were legends, but every legend has a bit of truth in it. In the mountains, the lines between what is real and what is imagined have always been blurry. Samuel Pruitt, the hunter who had found the disturbed land months before, started having scary visions. He would wake up in the middle of the night and see faces in the dark corners of the room and hear whispers that sounded like they were coming from inside the walls. His wife was trying to calm him down by saying it was just the wind or the drink. But Samuel knew it was something else. He had seen things in that cabin that he had never told anyone. Things that the sheriff had told him to keep quiet about. Samuel went missing while hunting in 1910. It looked like someone had carefully placed his rifle against a tree. His boots were next to him, untied, but there were no footprints showing where he had gone. The search took 3 days, but it didn't end with any answers. People said in whispers that Samuel had gone to the same place as the Greens, wherever that was. Martha Weaver, the archivist, kept looking for the truth without saying a word. She could look at old records that not many people knew about. She found papers from 1887 in a dusty storage room in the courthouse basement. They talked about a cabin built on the same spot where Joseph and Clara had lived. Daniel and Ruth Blackwood used to own the cabin that was there before. They had also vanished without a trace. Martha made connections that made her feel uneasy. Someone new moved into that property about every 20 years, and it always ended the same way. People went missing, investigations were never finished, and there was silence. It was a cycle that happened over and over again, like the seasons. She wrote down everything in her diary, but she never let anyone see it. She was scared of what would happen if she talked about these things in public. The green cabin, on the other hand, stayed empty. No one wanted to buy the land or build there again. The forest eventually took over the property, covering it with vines and thorny bushes. Time and lack of use erased the trail that led there. Even people who knew the area well had trouble finding it after a few years. But there were nights when people who lived far away swore they saw lights flashing in that direction. They looked like little yellowish lanterns moving through the trees. Some people thought they were fireflies or the moon's light. Some people thought they were the Greens, who were still there for some reason that the living couldn't understand. In 1912, a young journalist named Henry Cole came to the area to write about the stories that people told about the Appalachians. People talked about the Greens in bars and grocery stores, and he heard about them. He ran into the same kind of resistance that Richard Portman did when he tried to look into things. People frowned when he said Joseph and Clara. Some people just got up and left without saying anything. Henry was able to find Martha Weaver. She was older and more tired, but she agreed to talk as long as he didn't publish anything while she was still alive. Martha told him everything she knew, including her notes and the patterns she had found. Henry was both fascinated and scared at the same time. This story was bigger and scarier than any legend he had come to find. But when Henry tried to check the facts, he hit a wall of silence from the institution. The files Martha talked about were gone again. Sheriff Caldwell died in 1911, and he took his secrets with him. Richard Portman wouldn't talk about the case, only that some investigations should stay closed. Henry understood that he was dealing with something that the whole community had agreed to forget. Henry Cole left the area without telling anyone his story. For decades, he kept his notes in a box that was always closed. He went back to the spot where the green cabin used to be one last time before he left. He spent hours looking for the place, following unclear directions from an old hunter who said he would take him to a certain point. The hunter wouldn't go past a certain marked tree. Instead, he just pointed in the right direction and quickly walked back along the path. When Henry finally got to the clearing, he was shocked by what he saw. The cabin structure was still there, but it was hidden by thick plants. The windows were dark holes that looked like they were watching him. There was no sound at all. Not even birds sang there. Henry felt like the air had gotten thicker, and there was a weight on his chest. He took some pictures, but when he developed them weeks later, they were all blurry or had strange light spots on them. Years went by, and the green story became just another tale told in whispers on cold nights. Younger people didn't know the whole story. They only knew bits and pieces that were mixed in with other dark stories from the area. Joseph and Clara became almost mythical figures, useful ghosts to scare off curious visitors or explain strange things that happened. But in 1924, something brought the case back to light. A group of geologists came to West Virginia's Appalachian Mountains to make maps of caves and rock formations. One of the team members, a man named Frederick Walsh, got separated from the group while they were recording a system of natural tunnels. He was walking down a narrow hallway that looked promising when his flashlight lit up something he didn't expect. There were personal items all over the place, as if someone had camped there. An old leather backpack, rusty tools, scraps of fabric that used to be clothes, and something even more disturbing. Marks on the cave walls and symbols carved into the stone that Frederick didn't recognize. He called the others, and they all wrote down what happened. When they got back to town and told people about what they had found, one of the oldest people there recognized the backpack's description. It was the same as one that Joseph Green used to carry. The discovery sparked new rumors. If those things really belonged to the Greens, why were they in deep caves, miles away from their house? They asked the geologists if they had found any signs that people had lived there for a long time. Frederick said yes. There were signs of old campfires and places that looked like they had been used as temporary shelter, but they didn't find anything that showed where the couple was going. The authorities at the time did a quick search of the caves but gave up soon after. The system was big and dangerous, with tunnels going in all directions. Some went to deep pits, and others stopped at solid stone walls. It was easy to get lost there, and it didn't make sense to look for people who had gone missing 15 years earlier. The case was closed again. Martha Weaver was still alive in 1924, when she was 72 years old. She wasn't surprised when she found out about the discovery in the caves. In her diary, she wrote that she had always thought the cabin was only part of the story, and that something bigger was going on under the mountains. 2 years later, she died, and her niece found her diary. She didn't know what to do with all the pages full of theories and dark connections. The diary ended up in a box of things that were given to a nearby library. It stayed there for decades without anyone knowing it was there. The area changed over the years that followed. Paved roads, electricity reached the valleys, and the modern world began to break through the Appalachians' isolation. Time and lack of care finally caused the green cabin to fall apart. There were only a few pieces of stone foundation left to show that something had once been there. The trees grew thick and tall, blocking off the old clearing completely. But the stories kept going. In 1938, a writer of fiction named Thomas Brennan came to the area to do research for a book. He heard different versions of the green story. Some people said they were criminals on the run who were hiding out in the mountains. Some people thought they were just a sad couple who died in a terrible way. Some people even said they never existed and were just characters in a local legend that grew into something real. Thomas talked to people who said they knew the Greens personally, but their stories were so different that it was hard to tell what was real and what was made up. One man said that Joseph's eyes were 2 different colors. A woman said that Clara's face had a scar in the shape of a crescent. Another person said that they both spoke with an accent from another country. Each piece of evidence made things more confusing instead of clearer. Thomas's book was never made public. He wrote 3 different versions, each trying to get to the heart of the mystery, but none of them worked for him. There was something about the story that didn't fit into the usual patterns of beginning, middle, and end. It was like trying to grab fog with your hands. Thomas finally gave up and wrote other books, but he always wondered what really happened in those mountains. During World War II, a lot of people from outside the area came to work in the factories and mines that helped the war effort. A lot of these new people heard the old stories and added their own twists to them. The green story started to mix with other stories, becoming part of a bigger body of folklore about the mountains and the secrets they hold. In 1952, something amazing happened that made the names Joseph and Clara Green come back to the minds of people in the area. During the driest summer in decades, a terrible forest fire swept through the mountains of Pocahontas County. The fire burned thousands of acres, leaving behind a landscape of ashes and burned trees. When the firefighters were able to put out the fire, the cleanup crews got to work. They found things that had been hidden for a long time. They found structures buried in the area where the green property used to be, which was completely bare of plants because of the fire. There was more to it than just the cabin's foundation. There were stones that had been placed in a certain way, making it look like the remains of several smaller buildings around the main building. It was like the cabin that could be seen was just the center of a bigger building. Robert Hayes, a forestry engineer, was in charge of figuring out how bad the damage was when he saw the formations. He was interested in how carefully the stones were placed. It wasn't done by an amateur. Someone who knew how to build had planned it out well. Robert hired George Mullins, a retired professor and amateur archaeologist from his town, to look at the site. George was very interested in what he found. The buildings made it seem like more than a few people had lived there. There were signs of work areas, maybe for making tools or processing food. The layout showed that it was a bigger job that needed a lot of people and organization. But historical records said that only Joseph and Clara lived there. What could be the reason for the difference? George wrote down what he found, and Robert started asking the oldest people still living in the area questions. He found Violet Summers, an 84-year-old woman who was a little girl when the Greens went missing. Violet took a long time to respond, but she finally said that she had always known there were more people living on that mountain. When she was younger, she had seen them from time to time, faraway shapes moving through the trees. Violet said that groups of people would come and go like ghosts, and their faces would change all the time. Some people seemed to be just passing through, while others stayed for weeks before disappearing. She never told anyone because her father strictly forbade her from mentioning what she saw. At the time, she didn't understand why, but now, looking back through the decades, she realized that everyone knew something they preferred to ignore. Violet's revelation changed the nature of the investigation. If Joseph and Clara weren't alone, then the whole story needed to be retold. Robert began searching for others who could corroborate the account. He found 3 more elderly people willing to talk, all with fragmented memories of having seen unusual activity in that area of the mountains. One of them, a former lumberjack named Albert Price, remembered seeing loaded wagons going up the trail at night, something completely atypical for the time. George Mullins chose to go through the county archives that were still there to see if he could find anything that would help him understand what was going on. He spent weeks in dusty rooms going through old papers. That's when he came across something interesting. Records of supply purchases that didn't make sense for 2 people. People often ordered flour, salt, tools, and fabric in Joseph Green's name, but the amount suggested he was supplying a small group of people. George found even more disturbing letters between local businesses and suppliers from other cities that mentioned deliveries to that property that included medical supplies, chains, and padlocks in large amounts. Why would someone who lives alone in the mountains need so many locks? And what good were the medical supplies in a place so far from a hospital or clinic? Robert and George started to come up with a theory that made them very uneasy. What if the Green property wasn't just a house, but a station where people were held for a short time before being moved to another place? The location was smart because it was far enough away from people who might be interested, but still easy for people who knew the right paths to get to. In this context, the caves found in 1924 became more important. They could be used as escape routes or temporary hiding places, linking different parts of the mountains without the need for roads that could be seen. The tunnel system was huge, and old maps showed that some caves went on for kilometers and came out in valleys far away. It was the perfect natural network for moving around in secret. But this theory had a flaw. Where were these people going and why? Robert tried to figure out why people were going missing in the area by looking at dates and places. What he found out was upsetting. 14 people went missing in nearby counties between 1907 and 1910. They were all travelers, people who didn't have deep ties to the area. Some were migrant workers, while others were traveling salespeople, or people looking for gold in the mines. George thought that maybe there was a bigger group behind it, something that went beyond Joseph and Clara. Maybe they were just following orders from someone higher up in the hierarchy and were just doing their jobs. But if that were true, then the lack of news about the case made even more sense. Not only was the community keeping its secrets safe, but they might have been afraid of what would happen if they told them. Robert got an anonymous letter in 1953 that made him think about whether or not he should keep looking into the case. The letter was short and to the point. Some stones are better left unturned. There was no clear threat, but the tone was clear. Someone was watching what he was doing and didn't like it. Robert showed George the letter, and they both had to make a hard choice. George wanted to keep going. saying that the truth should be known, no matter how long it had been. Robert was more careful because he was worried about what might happen. They made one last effort to find records in Charleston that could either prove or disprove their suspicions. They would give the state authorities the evidence if they found it. If not, they would not bother with it. The trip to Charleston showed them things, but not what they had hoped for. The state archives had some information about the disappearances of the time, but the documents were shallow and almost purposefully unclear. There were no in-depth investigations, just basic reports that said the people probably moved or died by accident in the dangerous mountains. It was as if a curtain had been drawn over the whole thing, making it impossible for anyone to really look into it. Robert and George were unhappy when they got home. They had some of the pieces of a puzzle, but not all of them. They chose to write down everything they had learned and put it somewhere safe, hoping that future generations would be able to solve the mystery more easily. George made a detailed archive that included pictures of the buildings that were revealed by the fire, copies of the documents they found, and transcripts of the interviews they did with the older people who lived there. For almost 20 years, George Mullen's archive was stored in a wooden box in the attic of his house and was never looked at. George died in 1968, and he was still angry that he never finished his investigation. Caroline Mullins Porter, his daughter, got the house and all of her father's things. Caroline only found the box during spring cleaning in 1971 and decided to look inside. She was both interested and very upset by what she found. Caroline was a history teacher at a secondary school, and she naturally loved the mysteries of the past. She read each document and looked at each photograph that had turned yellow with age for weeks. Her father's notes were very detailed and full of questions that weren't answered, and connections that weren't clear between events that seemed unrelated. Caroline knew she was up against something big, a story that needed to be told, but she didn't know what to do next. She chose to start her own investigation, using newer tools than her father had. Caroline went back to Pocahontas County, which has changed a lot since then but still has some of its old charm. She looked for descendants of the people her father had talked to, hoping to find more information that had been passed down through the years. She found a wall of silence that was even harder to get through than the one her father had to deal with. The older families in the area were polite but didn't want to talk. They gave her tea and cookies, but when Caroline brought up the greens, their faces changed. Dorothy Henderson, Violet Summers' granddaughter, agreed to talk in private. Before her grandmother died, Dorothy had heard stories from her that had never been told to anyone else. She made Caroline promise that if she ever wrote about it, she wouldn't use real names. Dorothy said that her grandmother Violet had seen things that scared her until the day she died. These things weren't just strange people on the mountain. They were also things that didn't make sense for a simple rural property. Violet had said that on some nights she saw long lines of lanterns climbing the trail like silent parades that disappeared into the trees. She also said that there were sounds coming from that direction. Not exactly screams, but muffled voices that sounded like they were coming from below. The description made Caroline think of the caves that her dad wrote about. She made up her mind to go see that tunnel system for herself. She got in touch with a group of speleologists from a nearby university who were making maps of caves in the Appalachian Mountains. When she told the group why she was interested, two of them, David Chen and Rebecca Morse, said they would help her look into the caves that used to be on the Green family's property. In October 1971, the trip took place. The three people, who had modern flashlights, ropes, and mapping tools, climbed down into one of the main access points that geologists had recorded decades before. The system was even bigger than what the old map showed. There were branches that led to natural rooms of different sizes, some as small as closets and others as big as ballrooms. The walls were made of wet limestone that shone in the flashlight light. David saw something strange in one of the side chambers after they had been exploring for about 2 hours. There were marks on the stone that were meant to be there. These weren't natural formations. They were made by people using tools. The marks made patterns that looked like arrows pointing to certain passages. Someone had made a way for people to find their way around the caves without getting lost in the maze of tunnels. The group followed the tracks to a place that was clearly used by people. There were still signs of old campfires, and soot stains on the ceiling showed that the room had been used many times over the years. There were rusty metal pieces on the floor that looked like they could have been tools or utensils. Rebecca found something that made everyone stop. Pieces of fabric that the cave's constant humidity had kept intact and that still showed stitching patterns. Caroline took careful pictures of everything. She knew she was stepping on something important, but it was hard to tell what it was without more information. They kept looking around, following the notches in the walls. The tunnel system split off in many directions. Some passages were so small that they had to crawl through them, while others were wide enough for a group of people to walk next to each other. They made the most disturbing discovery in a deep chamber that was far away from any natural light. The room was about 10 meters wide and had a ceiling that had naturally curved over thousands of years of erosion. But the fake buildings were what really caught their attention. There were pieces of rotten wood on the walls that looked like they had been put there to make the space stronger or to divide it up. Circles of stones that had been carefully placed in the middle of the room looked like they were meant to hold something or mark off an area. David looked closely at the structures because he had worked in both archaeology and speleology before. He thought they were at least 60 to 70 years old, maybe even older. The wood was very old and falling apart, but you could still see cut marks and carvings that showed it was built on purpose. Someone had put a lot of time and effort into making that underground space useful for a certain purpose. Rebecca found something that made the mystery even deeper. A metal object that was partly buried in the wet cave soil turned out to be an old medallion when it was cleaned. It was so rusty that it was hard to make out the details, but it looked like there were engravings on the surface. Caroline carefully kept it safe because she wanted to take it to a professional who could fix it and read any writing it might have. The exploration continued for several more hours. They discovered that the cave system had at least 4 different exits in areas far from each other, emerging in valleys and slopes separated by kilometers. It was literally possible to enter at one point on the mountain and exit at a completely different one, entirely avoiding surface trails. For someone wanting to move unseen, it was the perfect system. When they finally emerged from the caves at dusk, the 3 were exhausted but electrified by the discovery. They had physical evidence that something significant had happened in those depths. The question was, how to connect these discoveries to the story of Joseph and Clara Green. Caroline decided she needed professional help. She got in touch with Professor Edmund Cross, a forensic anthropologist at West Virginia University. Professor Cross had a reputation for being both rigorous and discreet. He agreed to examine the evidence Caroline had collected. He was immediately interested when he saw the pictures and things that had been found in the caves. He put together a more official trip with the right gear and a group of graduate students. Caroline was invited to participate as a consultant, given her knowledge of local history. The second expedition, undertaken in the spring of 1972, was far more comprehensive. The team spent 5 days looking around the cave system and writing about what they found. They used modern dating methods on the organic materials they found, made detailed maps of the passages, and made a list of every artifact they found. Professor Cross was particularly interested in the navigational markings on the walls, which he determined to be consistent with tools used in the early 20th century. A significant discovery was made on the 4th day in a side chamber that had almost gone unnoticed. They found a place that looked like it had been closed off on purpose and then opened again. There were stones stacked up in a way that made it hard to get through, but someone had taken some of them away at some point in the past. They found a small hole behind these stones that held preserved things. There was an account book, but the pages were stuck together by moisture. Some of the writing was still readable. The book had entries from 1907 to 1909 that were written in a cramped, hard-to-read handwriting. The entries looked like records of transactions, with names, dates, and numbers. There was no explanation of what the numbers represented, but the patterns were clear. There was regularity in the entries, suggesting organized and continuous operations. Professor Cross also found letters that were written but never sent. One of them was signed by Clara Green and sent to someone with the initials J.M. in a town in Tennessee. The letter was broken up, but it talked about problems with goods and worries about routes being watched. The language was coded, which made it clear that the writer was trying to hide what the words really meant. Caroline spent hours trying to figure out what the letters and ledger meant. She started to see that she was dealing with proof of a complicated operation that went beyond the mountains of West Virginia. Some of the places that were talked about were in Kentucky, Tennessee, and even Ohio. The Green property appeared to be one of the nodes in a network of people and places that were all connected in some way. Professor Cross said that they might be looking at proof of smuggling or illegal trade. The timing was right because there were big changes in the law in the United States at the time, and the Appalachian Mountains had always been known for their strange activities. But no one knew what was being smuggled or sold. The papers were very vague, using words that could mean a lot of different things. It took months of careful work to look through the documents found in the caves. Professor Cross put together a small group of experts to help restore and understand the materials. An expert in early 20th century codes and ciphers was called in. He saw that the letters used a mix of simple substitute code and business jargon from the time, which made them look like real business letters to people who weren't trained to read them. Caroline did a lot of research on the history of the area. She spent weeks in the libraries of Charleston and nearby universities looking for information that could help her understand what she had found. She found references to something that not many modern historians know about while she was looking for information: the secret routes that crossed the Appalachians in the early 1900s to move goods and people out of the sight of the authorities. Some newspapers at the time talked about federal investigations into illegal transportation networks in the mountains. The articles were vague and didn't name names or exact places, but there was a pattern. The operations took place mostly in remote areas, using caves and old trails, and depended on the fact that people in those areas were quiet. The authorities knew something was going on, but they could never get past the mountain people's protection. In June 1972, Caroline got a phone call that she wasn't expecting. An old man named William said he had information about the Greens that might interest her. He wouldn't give any more information over the phone, but he did suggest meeting at a cafe in a neutral town that was far away from both Charleston and Pocahontas County. Caroline, who was careful but interested, said yes. She brought Professor Cross with her to keep him safe. William was 83 years old and looked like he had been through a lot. His hands were twisted from arthritis, and his eyes had that faraway look of someone who had seen things they would rather forget. He said that his father had been a messenger in the mountains while the Greens lived there. William's father never talked about his work in public, but William, who was still a child at the time, had heard things he shouldn't have. William said that there was a whole underground economy going on in the Appalachians. People were always moving between states, avoiding main roads and checkpoints. In some circles, the Green property was known as a safe place to stop and rest before continuing on their way. There was something else, though, that his father never wanted to fully explain. When he talked about that place, his father sounded scared. William brought a small notebook with him that had belonged to his father and that he had kept for years. There were lists of names and dates in the notebook, as well as simple notes that didn't seem to mean anything at first. But when Caroline looked at the lists next to the accounting book she found in the caves, she saw that they matched. Some of the same names were in both documents, and the dates were close to each other. It was one more piece of the puzzle. William said something that made Caroline and Professor Cross look at each other in a meaningful way. He said that his father once said that people who climbed that mountain didn't always come back down. William's father shook his head and said that some questions were better left unanswered when William asked what that meant. This phrase sounded like things Caroline had heard many times before during her research. There were 3 hours of meeting with William. He told bits of stories and memories his father had told him about the mountains and their secrets. He said that the area changed in the years after the Green family went missing. The trails became quiet at night, and life slowly returned to normal. It felt like a whole operation had suddenly come to an end. Caroline and Professor Cross sat in silence for a long time after William left, thinking about what they had heard. They were putting together something big and well-organized that had involved a lot of people over the years. But there were still some important pieces missing. What exactly was being moved along these routes? Who was in charge? And most importantly, what happened to Joseph and Clara Green? Professor Cross said that the Greens might not be the leaders, but just middlemen in a bigger organization. If something went wrong, if they were found out, or if they stopped being active, the people above them in the chain of command could have killed them. This would explain why they suddenly and completely disappeared, as well as why there has been no public comment on the case. Local officials may have been told or paid not to look too closely into the matter. Caroline chose to take a different path. There must be financial records somewhere, like bank transfers and investments, if the Greens were part of a bigger group. Even when people try to hide it, money always leaves traces. She started looking through old bank records from towns near the Green property to find strange transactions or patterns that looked suspicious during those important years. The job was huge. Records from banks from the early 20th century were not digitized. Many of them had been lost or destroyed over the years. Caroline went to dozens of banks and credit unions, some of which are no longer in business but have records stored in state vaults. It was boring work to go through old handwritten ledgers and look for anything that stood out. After weeks of looking and getting nowhere, she finally found something that caught her eye. A bank in Marlington had records of an account opened in 1907 in the name of a company called Appalachian Resource Management. The account got regular deposits from different sources, always in small amounts that didn't draw attention to themselves, but over the months they added up to a large sum. The most interesting thing was that people whose names changed often always took money out of the account in person, in cash. Caroline knew 2 of the names, one of which was Joseph Green. The other was the traveling salesman who went missing in 1908. Finally, there was a direct financial link that connected different parts of the story. Caroline told Professor Cross about what she had found. They started looking for Appalachian Resource Management together. The state registered the company in 1906, but it suddenly went out of business in 1910, not long after the events at the Green property. The directors' names were common names that were probably fake, and the address on file was just a post office box in Charleston that is no longer there. The pattern was becoming clearer. There was a real business going on the surface, with normal-looking transactions and paperwork. But underneath, things were very different. The business was a front for moving money and making it look like it was legal, while the real work was going on in the mountain's shadows. To look at the transaction patterns, Professor Cross brought in an economist from the university who specializes in the history of money. Harold Klein, an economist who was very careful, was very interested in how complicated the scheme was. He said that the financial structure was unusually advanced for the time and place. The person who planned this knew how to hide cash flows and how to do accounting. Harold said that maybe there were other companies like this one that were running at the same time and handling different parts of the business. He started looking for similar patterns in business records from other counties. What he found confirmed what he thought. At least 3 other companies with similar traits were registered at the same time, worked in remote mountainous areas, and suddenly went out of business between 1909 and 1911. Caroline thought she should talk to William again, the old man who had told her about her father's life. She was able to find him again and set up another meeting. This time, she brought the financial records and asked him if he knew any of the people who worked for Appalachian Resource Management. William looked over the papers for a long time, his tired eyes scanning the lists of names. He knew 3 other names besides Joseph Green. One was a merchant his father had talked about from time to time. He was a man who seemed to know people in a lot of different states. Another was a local bailiff who had been quietly let go from his job in 1910 without anyone knowing why. The third name made William visibly hesitate. It was a well-known businessman with investments in mining and lumber all over the area. William said that this business person, whose name he asked not to be written down, was known for being untouchable. He had political ties at the state level, owned a lot of land, and hired hundreds of people. This would explain why the investigations always hit institutional walls if he was involved in the operation. Someone above was protecting them and wanted to keep some things secret. This new information changed the way the research worked. Caroline and Professor Cross figured out that they weren't just dealing with regular criminals who were on the fringes of society. They were dealing with something that had effects on the establishment itself. This made things more dangerous, but also more important. If they could write down what they found in a clear way, it would be a big help in understanding that time and place in history. They chose to look for political records from that time as well. Caroline spent weeks in state archives looking at official letters, reports from legislative committees, and records of people being appointed to public office. It was hard work, but she finally found proof that people in the state were worried about illegal activities in the mountains. However, these worries were always downplayed or redirected. There were internal memos that talked about investigations that were supposed to happen but never did. There were budgets set aside for oversight, but they were quietly used for other things. And there was the most powerful silence of all. No one was talking about problems that were clearly there. It seemed like everyone had agreed not to look too closely at what was going on in faraway places. In the meantime, Professor Cross was working on something else. He knew people at other museums and universities that studied the history of Appalachia. He started quietly asking if anyone else had found similar proof in other places. The answers were very revealing. Several researchers said they had come across similar strange events in history, such as properties that were cut off from the rest of the world, people who went missing for no reason, and investigations that went nowhere. A historian at the University of Kentucky had a collection of stories from old mountain families. Some of these stories talked about networks of movement across the Appalachian Mountains that the authorities couldn't see. A North Carolina anthropologist had written down stories about places in the mountains that people stayed away from because they were thought to be cursed or dangerous for reasons that were never made clear. The pattern held true over a large area of land. There was something going on in the mountains during those years that was affecting many communities, but they all chose not to talk about it. The silence was a cultural thing that had been passed down through the years as a way to keep people safe. People thought it was dangerous to talk about these things because it broke an unwritten rule that kept the peace. Caroline started to see that Joseph and Clara Green were only a small part of a much bigger picture. They were points in a complicated network that ran across the Appalachian Mountains and linked communities that were otherwise cut off from each other in ways that official records never showed. The real story wasn't about two people. It was about whole systems that worked on the edges of organized society. Caroline and Professor Cross decided to put everything they had learned into a complete manuscript in December 1972. It wouldn't be sold to the public, but it would be put in a number of academic archives so that the information would still be available, even if something happened to them. The document would be hundreds of pages long and would carefully list each piece of evidence, each connection, and each discovery they had made. It took months to write the manuscript. They were very careful, citing sources, including photos, and writing down original documents. They wanted to make a record that would stand up to the toughest academic tests. They knew that their conclusions would be controversial and could hurt powerful people, so they had to make sure the evidence was solid. During this time, the pressure on them slowly grew stronger. The university told Professor Cross that they were looking into his research funding again. Caroline got job offers in other cities that paid well and seemed too good to be true. These jobs would clearly take her mind off of her current research. These were ways to break them up and stop their work without directly confronting them. They fought against these pressures and kept working. The manuscript was finished by April 1973. They made several copies and sent them to archives in different states. Some of these were in public institutions, while others were in the private collections of trusted researchers. It was their way of making sure that the story would live on and that all of their hard work would not be for nothing. Caroline and Professor Cross thought they would get some kind of response after putting the manuscript in safe places. But there was only silence. There were no direct threats or big fights. There was something that might have been even more disturbing: planned indifference. The schools that got copies of the work politely thanked them and put them away without much fuss. It was like the story was just taken in by bureaucracies and then forgotten. Caroline tried to get the media interested, but the journalists she talked to didn't seem very interested. The story was old, the evidence was weak, and there wasn't a clear news hook that made it worth a lot of journalistic investigation. One newspaper editor said honestly that stories about little-known historical crimes didn't sell, unless there was a mystery that the public found interesting. And even then, it would have to be done in a way that didn't upset readers or advertisers who have a lot of power. Professor Cross started to get the picture. It wasn't that the truth was being actively hidden by direct censorship. It was something more subtle and maybe more effective. People just didn't want to tell the story about that time and place. It was hard to understand, made things uncomfortable, and went against the simpler versions of regional history that communities had made for themselves over the years. Caroline took a job at a small college in the eastern part of the state in 1974. She kept doing research, but in a smaller way, while also teaching and working on other things. In 1976, Professor Cross retired and spent his last years in academia studying other subjects. Both were still interested in the Green case, but they knew they had reached the limit of what they could find with the resources and access they had. The Appalachian region changed a lot in the 1980s. The economy changed, people got older, and a lot of the older communities broke up as young people moved to cities to find jobs. People who remembered the old stories started to die off, and the stories themselves started to fade. What used to be common knowledge, even if not openly spoken, became bits of memory that only a few old people still have. In 1985, Caroline went to the old green property one last time. The forest had taken back the whole area. She would have had a hard time finding where the cabin used to be without her notes and maps. The structures that the fire uncovered in 1952 were once again buried under years of plants. It was like the land didn't want to show its secrets, with new life covering up signs of the past. She walked around the place, thinking about what she had learned and what she still didn't know. Joseph and Clara Green were still mysteries, more defined by what they didn't say than by what they did. before they got to the mountains, no one knew what their lives were like, where they were going, or even why they were going. They were ghosts from the past, only showing up in broken documents and old memories. At that moment, Caroline realized something important. Maybe the Green story wasn't really about them as people. Maybe it was about how societies deal with their shadows, or the parts of their past that don't fit into neat stories. The Appalachians have a long history of being alone, being free, and not following orders from outside sources. There were times in that history when things happened that weren't known or seen by the official record. Joseph and Clara were part of this secret world, which ran alongside the real world that was recorded and documented. There were no written rules, but there were local loyalties and strategic silences. Trying to figure it out using normal historical research methods was like trying to catch fog with your hands. You could see it, feel its effects, but you could never really hold it. A new group of casual investigators found out about the Green story in the 1990s, when the internet and new research tools became available. People started talking about the case on online forums that were focused on historical mysteries and unsolved cases. There were a lot of theories, and each one was more complicated than the last. Some people thought the Greens were part of a high-tech criminal group. Some people thought they were victims of events that just got lost in history. Caroline, who is now retired, watched these talks with some interest. It was nice to see that people were interested in the story, but it was also frustrating to see how often the information was wrong or blown out of proportion. Speculation turned into facts that were confidently stated. Weak links were shown as strong proof. People made up dramatized stories that were more satisfying than the real story with all its ambiguities and uncertainties. Caroline got a call from Marcus Riley, an independent documentary filmmaker, in 2003. He was working on a project about stories from the Appalachian Mountains that had been lost, and he wanted to include a part about the Greens. Caroline said she would do the interview, but only if certain conditions were met. She said that any telling of the story should make it clear what was known and what was just a guess. Marcus agreed, and the documentary that came out of it was one of the few responsible ones about the case. The documentary featured interviews with Caroline, displayed photographs of the structures found in the caves, and showcased some of the retrieved documents. But it was also honest about how much could be known. Marcus didn't try to make a big ending where all the mysteries were solved. Instead, he accepted the uncertainty and let the story stay that way. People had different opinions about the reception. Some people liked how calm and thoughtful it was. Some people didn't like it because they wanted clear answers that the documentary couldn't give them. One critic said that it was an important reminder that not all stories have clear endings, and that the past often fights against the organized story we try to impose on it. Caroline lived until 2011, when she died at the age of 79. She sometimes gave talks at local colleges in her later years about how important it is to keep regional histories, even if they are uncomfortable or incomplete. She said that the point of studying the past wasn't always to solve all the mysteries, but to learn how societies worked, how power worked, and how memory was made and kept. Professor Cross passed away in 2005, having had a long and successful career and made important contributions to the historical archaeology of the Appalachian region. He wrote a chapter about the Green case in his academic autobiography. In it, he talked about what the investigation taught him about the limits of historical knowledge and how the past still affects the present in ways we don't always see. The archives they made stayed in different places, where researchers could look at them. Every now and then, a graduate student or an independent historian would find the material and try to come up with new ideas or find more proof. Some people made small contributions by finding documents that Caroline and Professor Cross had not seen, but none of them were able to answer the main questions that were still hanging over the story. In the end, the land where Joseph and Clara lived became part of a state forest preservation area. There are signs that show where the hiking trails are, but there is no mention of the history of the place. People who are just passing through have no idea that they are walking on land where strange things used to happen and where people didn't know where they were going. The forest keeps its secrets to itself, giving us beautiful scenery without revealing any history. The caves are still there, and speleologists and adventurers sometimes go into them. The carvings on the walls are still there, but they have faded over time and with the humidity. There are now empty spaces where man-made structures used to be. Only impressions in the stone show that something was there. You can go to these places and feel the weight of history, even if you don't know the exact events that took place. The story of Joseph and Clara Green has been stuck between what is known and what is not known for years. It is stuck between what is documented and what is still a mystery that no one can figure out. It is a story that reminds us of something important about how we think about the past. Not all questions have answers, and not all paths lead to clear ends. The Appalachian Mountains keep rising up in a beautiful and quiet way, just like they always have. There are so many stories in their thick forests and deep valleys that they will never be able to tell them all. The mist still hangs around the pines at dawn, making shapes that look like people who aren't really there. It's a place where imagination finds fertile ground, where silence speaks louder than words. Today, decades after the events that captured the attention of researchers and curious onlookers, the region has changed unrecognizably in some aspects and remained exactly the same in others. Modern roads cut through areas that were once accessible only by narrow trails. Cell phone towers dot the ridges where only trees once stood. But among these marks of modernity, there are still places where time seems to have stood still, where the forest is impenetrable, and where the echoes of the past seem more present. There's something powerful about stories that don't resolve perfectly. They leave us with questions that make us think about them over and over. Why do some stories not come to an end? What does it mean when the past won't tell us everything? Perhaps these questions are as important as any answers we might find. The Green family story has become part of local folklore, but transformed by time and repetition. People who live in the area today know bits and pieces of the story that have been passed down through the years. Some people think the story is made up, a legend made up to amuse tourists. Others feel there must be some hidden truth somewhere, even if specific details have been lost or distorted. There are no historical markers where the cabin used to be. There are no statues or memorials. Not getting official recognition is a comment on how societies choose which parts of their past to keep and honor. Some stories are accepted and become part of a community's identity, while others are allowed to fade away because they are too inconvenient or not worth remembering. Walking through the mountains becomes even more interesting for people who know the history. Every empty clearing, every stone foundation covered in moss, and every dark cave could be important. Is this one of the places where something happened? Could that trail that was forgotten have been part of a longer route? The landscape turns into a text that can be read in many ways, and each reading tells us something about both the present and the past. Caves, in particular, have an almost mythical quality. They are the literal and figurative underground, the places where things happen that aren't in plain sight. When you explore them today, you get a taste of what researchers felt decades ago, the feeling of mystery and the idea that these rock formations saw things that are still partly hidden. We who are far away in time can see patterns that people living in the moment couldn't fully see. We see how stories are made and taken apart. We see how forgetting can be just as active as remembering. It is a force that shapes what stays and what goes. Joseph and Clara Green, whoever they were, are now mostly in people's heads. They have become more than people. They are symbols of something about the hidden parts of American history, about lives lived on the edge, and about the secrets that communities keep and take to the grave. They are people who live in the space between fact and fiction, where history and legend meet. Stories like this make me feel sad in a certain way. They remind us how fragile our memories are and how easy it is to forget things. A generation passes away, taking with it unwritten knowledge. Documents get ruined or just fall apart. Nature takes back physical places. What we have left are pieces, hints, and the nagging feeling that something important happened, even though we can't quite put our finger on what it was. But maybe this uncertainty is also freeing in some way. It helps us understand how little we can know and how important it is to be humble when looking at the vast history of humanity. You don't have to explain everything in detail. Not every mystery has to be solved. Sometimes the most honest story is the one that admits it has holes. The mountains don't care about what people do to try to understand them or the stories that happened on their slopes. They were there long before Joseph and Clara Green showed up, and they will still be there long after everyone has forgotten about them. This point of view is comforting because it reminds us that our stories are only short parts of much bigger stories. The Green story has something valuable for people who like stories like this, who are interested in unanswered questions and paths that lead to dead ends. It makes you think about how we know what we know, how we organize information, and the assumptions we make when we try to put together the lives of people who lived before us. It also serves as a reminder that history isn't just about famous people and big events. It is also about regular people in regular places whose lives may have been complicated and important in ways that were never fully written down. There are hidden stories and untold stories in every community and region that aren't in official records. We only have bits and pieces of the story: a cabin in a clearing, marks on cave walls, papers with names and dates that never tell the whole story, and testimonies from people who saw things they couldn't fully explain. We are left with the quiet of the mountains and the heavy questions that keep coming up over the years. The story of Joseph and Clara Green, which is full of uncertainty and mystery, is still a testament to the dark parts of human experience, to places where the light doesn't fully reach, and to stories that don't have clear endings. It is a story that belongs to the mountains as much as to any one person. It is rooted in a specific time and place, but its themes of secrecy, silence, and the unknown are also strangely timeless. Thank you for coming along on this trip through the Appalachians' historical shadows. These kinds of stories make us think more deeply, ask more questions, and realize that the past is always more complicated than it seems at first. If you like this story, you might want to subscribe to the channel to see more stories and mysteries that have been lost to time and the mists of the mountains. Also, please leave a comment about what you thought of this journey we've taken together through time.